Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. We're just going to give folks a couple more minutes to tune in, and then we will get started with today's webinar. Thanks to everyone who has joined so far. We're just going to give it one more minute before we get started. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for your patience, everyone. We just wanted to make sure everyone could join and log in. So I am Roya Hegdahl. I am a communications manager for Ocean Conservancy's plastics program, and I will be hosting today. We will be kicking off this call with a scene setting on the current state of the international legally binding instrument on plastics pollution. This is commonly referred to as the Plastics Treaty. Then we'll learn about some ghost gear and why it needs to be part of the agreement, as well as an overview of Ocean Conservancy's other priorities in the treaty. And then finally, we'll open the last 30 minutes open to a Q&A, because we want this to be an opportunity for both the media and the public to be able to ask our experts any questions that they have. So with that, let me go ahead and introduce our panelists. So first up, we will have Felipe Victoria, who is our Senior Manager for Policy and International Plastics at Ocean Conservancy. He's going to be giving the Plastics Treaty scene setting. Felipe leads Ocean Conservancy's international policy work across a wide array of marine pollution and conservation issues. Felipe joined Ocean Conservancy after working for over a decade in diplomacy, including over 5 years at the United Nations in New York. Then we'll have Joel, who's the Associate Director of Ocean Conservancy's Global Ghost Gear Initiative. Before joining the Triple GI, Joel worked for 20 years in the Canadian fishing industry, 13 of which were as operations supervisor for Stevenson Harbour Authority, which is Canada's largest commercial fishing harbour. During his time at Stevenson Harbour, Joel started and led an end-of-life net recycling program to find a sustainable way to dispose of end-of-life fishing nets. And then we'll have Dr. Anya Brandon, who is Ocean Conservancy's Associate Director of U.S. Plastics Policy. She has a PhD in environmental engineering from Stanford University, where she studied novel ways of breaking down plastics. Before joining Ocean Conservancy, Anya served in the office of U.S. Senator Jeff Merkley as the lead policy advisor on issues including plastics, oceans, and water. She's also been a lead advisor in the creation of several federal and state plastic pollution bills, such as California's SB 54 and the Federal Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act. So thank you all so much for being here. I'm excited to hear from all three of you. Now I'm going to kick it over to Felipe to start us off with the Plastics Treaty scene setting.
Thank you, Roya. I'm going to start out with an overview of the current state of the International Legally Binding Instrument on Plastic Pollution. The acronym for that is ILBI, but it's commonly referred to as the Plastics Treaty. As you know, plastic pollution has become a crisis for our planet, and the ocean bears the brunt of that. Sadly, all forecasts indicate that global plastic pollution will continue to get worse unless we make bold systemic changes to address it head-on. Thankfully, there has been consensus from the international community that we must come together to tackle this issue. In May of 2022, in Nairobi, a historical resolution was reached to put together an international legally binding agreement to address plastic pollution. The open-ended working group is the group that is in charge of the initial procedural items to start the negotiations. They decided on a tentative timeline to draft the agreement by the end of 2024 or early 2025. This was agreed to under Resolution 514, which is a United Nations resolution that created what is commonly known as the Plastics Treaty. The slide you have in front of you is an overview of the timeline for the development of that treaty. As you can see, we are now in the lead up to the meeting, which will take place in Paris from May 29th to June the 2nd. This meeting is known as the Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee 2, or INC 2. This particular meeting is critical for the drafting process because following INC 2, a document known as the Zero Draft will be released. The Zero Draft will outline the options, scope, structure, control measures, and all other items discussed during the in-person negotiations. Once the Zero Draft is released, it becomes very difficult to change or add any new language to it that was not specifically discussed during the in-person meeting happening in Paris. Despite being the single most harmful form of marine debris and a major contributor to ocean plastic pollution, so far, fishing gear or ghost gear measures were not mentioned, even in passing, in the treaty resolution adopted in March of 2022. The UN Environmental Program Secretariat also invited countries to submit recommendations, but even among those submissions, the issue of fishing gear and ghost gear have barely been mentioned. For those reasons, it is crucial that fishing gear becomes part of the conversation happening in INC 2. In terms of the negotiation timeline, it is now or never. Now, I'll pass it over to my colleague Joel, who will talk in more detail about the problem of ghost gear and why we're pushing for its inclusion in the treaty.
Thank you, Felipe. Always a tough act to follow. Most people are aware of the impacts of plastic bottles, plastic bags, single-use packaging, and other common forms of plastic pollution that are commonly seen on beaches and shores around the world. Many people have seen this themselves when they go to the beach, and so they have an experiential link to it. But fewer people have a clear understanding of the impacts of abandoned, lost, or discarded fishing gear, also known as ghost gear, the majority of which is made from plastics. Fishing gear loss is generally unintentional and can happen for a variety of reasons, from severe weather like hurricanes to underwater snacking system malfunctions. But whatever the cause, fishing gear can be very expensive to replace, and so no fisher ever wants to lose their gear. After all, it's the means by which they harvest seafood to feed their own families and the some 3.5 billion people around the world that rely on seafood as their primary source of protein. That said, while intentional discard can occur on occasion, it's mostly linked to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And while it sometimes washes up on shore, for the most part, when lost, fishing gear stays underwater, where most people can't see it. So in many ways, it's an invisible plastic pollution issue. While it's clear that ghost gear is a major contributor to ocean plastic pollution, global estimates on exactly how much is made up of ghost gear are incredibly difficult to do reliably, due to significant variation in causes for gear loss across different gear types, fisheries, and geographical regions. That being said, there's a growing amount of research from plastic pollution hotspots like the ocean gyres. Ocean gyres are where currents circulate, and due to the circular motion of these currents, plastic pollution collects into what are commonly known as garbage patches. The Great Pacific Garbage Patch is perhaps the most famous of these, but there are garbage patches of varying sizes in each of the 5 ocean gyres. When researchers go to these garbage patches and study what's in them, they found across multiple studies that between 46 to 86% of the floating macroplastics by weight in the ocean gyres are ghost gear. This is a huge problem because Ocean Conservancy studies have also shown that ghost gear is, pound for pound, the most harmful form of marine plastic pollution. And this is unsurprising given it's purposely designed to catch fish, and it does so extremely efficiently, whether it's under the control of a responsible fisher or whether it's been lost at sea. According to a 2015 study, a single abandoned net is estimated to kill an average of 500,000 marine invertebrates, 1,700 fish, and 4 seabirds. Ghost gear has been shown to cause up to a 30% decline in some fish stocks, depending on the region and the gear type. And one study estimated that 90% of species caught in lost gear were of commercial value. In this way, ghost gear threatens global food security, fishery sustainability, and those whose lives and livelihoods depend on healthy fish populations and thriving marine ecosystems. Beyond entangling and killing sea life, ghost gear can also damage, smother, and destroy sensitive habitats like mangroves and coral reefs. Ghost gear also prevents a navigation hazard to vessels, sometimes getting tangled in propellers and rudders, for example. And in addition to entanglement, sea life has also been found to ingest ghost gear. Large, tangled masses of fishing gear and other plastic debris have been found inside the stomachs of beached whales. Over time, as gear breaks down due to ultraviolet light and wind and wave action, plastic gear breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces and finally into microplastics that become nearly impossible to remove from the environment, which Anya will touch on in a moment. These small fragments and microplastics are often found in small fish and mollusks. And once ingested, plastic can block their digestive system and can prevent animals from absorbing nutrients, slowly starving them to death. In order to address and prevent these harms caused by ghost gear, in 2015, the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, or the GGI as we call it, was founded. The GGI is the world's only cross-sectoral alliance dedicated to tackling ghost gear on a global level. With 135 member organizations from 6 continents across a variety of groups, including academia, the private sector, fishers and the seafood industry, retailers, technology companies, NGOs, and more. We also have the support of 20 official member governments. The GGI is the umbrella under which the global community working on ghost gear can unite to address this issue, bringing everyone around the table to collaborate towards holistic, lasting solutions to ghost gear. The aim of the GGI is to lead the charge on bringing ghost gear to the front of the global marine plastic pollution agenda by providing input and recommendations around ghost gear into various international policy fora, such as the ILBI, bringing together organizations around the world to address ghost gear, encouraging and facilitating discussion and collaboration locally and across national boundaries, and amplifying the impacts of our member organizations around the world. And since the causes and impacts of ghost gear are significantly different from those of most other sources of plastic pollution, the GGI is advocating for language in the Plastics Treaty that specifically acknowledges its unique causes and impacts. We believe that the Plastics Treaty should call out specific actions that member states and others can do to address the issue of ghost gear. The Plastics Treaty presents a unique, once-in-a-generation opportunity to find lasting and binding solutions to plastic pollution, and we believe ignoring the unique role of ghost gear in the ocean plastic pollution crisis would be a mistake. Through our work, the GGI has developed a best practice framework for the management of fishing gear to guide our members, organizations around the world, and the public on best practices to prevent and mitigate the harmful impacts of ghost gear. Based on our data and research on best practices, we're developing a suite of specific recommendations to include both mandatory and voluntary measures in the plastics treaty around ghost gear, as we see this as a critical opportunity to address this critical issue as holistically as possible. And now I'll pass to Anya for a presentation about the impacts of plastics have on the ocean and Ocean Conservancy's other important priorities for ocean protection through the plastics treaty. Anya, over to you.
Thank you, Joel. Ocean plastic pollution has reached a crisis level, and it's impacting all of us. Each year, an estimated 11 million metric tons of plastics enter our ocean from land-based sources alone. That is to say, ghost gear is not included in that estimate, incredibly. Plastic pollution in all of its forms is deadly to ocean wildlife. As Joel mentioned, animals can die from entanglement or ingestion. Further, we know that the toxic chemicals that are included in plastics as additives can also leach from plastics and have been shown to impact feeding, reproductive, and other wildlife behaviors. As nearly 99% of plastics are made out of fossil fuels, we also know that the exponential increase in plastic production is fueling the climate crisis, which is also wreaking havoc on our ocean. Half of all plastics ever made have been made in the last 20 years, which means what we do in the next 20 years matters a lot. Fortunately, we have the tools and the knowledge to tackle this crisis. That is why the Plastics Treaty is so important. Without bold action, ocean plastic pollution is expected to triple to nearly 29 million metric tons per year by 2040. That would be equivalent to a cargo ship's worth of plastics entering our lakes, rivers, and ocean every single day. This treaty represents an unparalleled opportunity to take global action on a global problem. Ghost gear is one of our big priorities as we enter INC2, since, as Felipe and Joel have mentioned, it's now or never for that issue. Another opportunity we see is ambitious source reduction measures. Simply put, we need to make less plastics, period. Scientists estimate that to reduce ocean plastic pollution from where it's projected to go back to 2010 levels of 8 million metric tons a year, which is still 8 million metric tons too much plastic in the ocean, we need to reduce plastic use and consumption by 25 to 40%. Since 40% of plastics produced each year are for packaging, targeting single-use plastic packaging and foodware must be central to any strategy to tackle plastic pollution. It is also these items that most often end up polluting our beaches and our ocean. That is why we are calling on negotiators to include a source reduction requirement, specifically including targets on single-use plastics as part of the treaty. Fortunately, there is precedent for this type of bold and ambitious source reduction mandate. Last year, California, which represents the 5th largest economy in the world, passed a bill that will require exactly this, a 25% reduction in all single-use plastic packaging and foodware over the next 10 years. This policy is expected to prevent the creation of 23 million tons of single-use plastics, equivalent to the weight of 26 Golden Gate bridges. I want to switch gears here a little and talk about microplastics. When we think about all the bottles and food wrappers and other single-use items that we typically see on beaches, we need to remember that these and all plastics in the ocean break down over time into microplastics. And microplastics, which are plastics less than 5 millimeters in size, are the most pervasive, mobile, and easily distributed type of plastic pollution, meaning they are now ubiquitous in the environment and in the food web. Due to their shape and size and high surface area to volume ratio, once in the environment, microplastics can concentrate toxic chemicals up to 1 million times more than in ambient water. Ingestion of microplastics by wildlife has been associated with reduced seafood consumption, reduced energy for growth, and altered gene expressions. In some species, like those small plankton that make up the foundation of our food web, Microplastics can block digestive tracts, cause insufficient nutrient absorption, and internal damage. Bacteria and pathogens can also be found on the surface of microplastics, which can then act as a vector to spread disease. We as humans are known to ingest microplastics through the food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe, to the tune of almost 1,000 microplastics a day per adult. While the research on human impacts remains preliminary, there is evidence that microplastic exposure is linked to inflammation, oxidative stress, and tissue damage. Microplastics were specifically called out in the treaty resolution text, which is an important acknowledgement of the need to address this harmful type of plastic pollution. And we hope that specific actions targeting microplastics are also included in the final text of the agreement. Back over to you, Roya, for our Q&A portion.
Thank you, everyone. Those were wonderful presentations, giving such a good overview of what's at stake and what's going on right now with the Plastics Treaty. So now we're going to go to questions from the audience. We're going to start with a few journalist questions, and then we'll turn over to public questions who a mix of those that are coming in live and ones that were submitted ahead of time. If you are joining us right now from our YouTube channel, you can also feel free to add any other questions that you have to the chat, and we will add them to the list of questions that we are taking today. If you are a journalist who is joining us live as well, please raise your hand in the chat if you have a question and would like us to call on you. And then I'll call on you, unmute you, and then please state your name and outlet before your question. All right, and with that, we will go ahead and get started. So our first question we had submitted by Jamie Hailstone at Forbes. And the question is, how likely is it that we will see an international consensus emerging on the subject? Felipe, if you'd like to take this one.
Thank you, Roya. Thank you very much. That is actually a great question. And I think overall, there is a very strong international consensus on the problem, for absolutely sure. I think the problems are more than self-evident to countries that are participating in the negotiations, to all the other stakeholders participating in the negotiation, be it that civil society, the private sector, academia, foundations, etc. So I think overall that there is strong consensus on the problem. There is also broad emerging consensus on many of the proposed solutions as well. And I think there are blocks of countries that are binding around together this broad areas of consensus. Of course, there will be some where more deeper debates are yet to be held. But I think overall, the international community should be optimistic that countries will try to solve this problem, that they will build this consensus. And we urge these countries to be bold when trying to craft this emerging consensus as to be holistic in their approach, that do not approach this as a patchwork of disconnected solutions. And finally, that to realize that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to tackle this issue at the core for generations to come.
Thank you so much, Felipe. Next, we have a question submitted by James Bruggers from Inside Climate News. This one is also for Felipe. Why is this upcoming session so important to the outcome of any potential treaty?
Thank you, Roya. Well, that is also a great question. For those that had the chance to follow a little bit the INC1 negotiations in Uruguay, in Punta del Este specifically, most of the substantive conversations that a lot of the observers were expecting did not happen. I think a lot of time was spent around broader discussions on some of the elements and some of the structure and the procedural rules of the process, but not so much in the specific elements of option, structure, scope. And I think this meeting in person in Paris for the INC2 will be fundamental to go into the more in-depth topics of the plastic pollution issue at its core. And I think this is going to be fundamental to inform the Secretariat, which is in the hands of the UN Environment Program, to then go back for the intersessional period between INC2 and INC3, late November of this year, to bring out this zero draft. And so what we discussed briefly during my presentation. And I think that in that sense, the conversations that are going to be held in Paris are fundamental to give perspective, thoughts, and ideas to be included into the actual draft that will start to continue to build the negotiation as we move forward. So I think that is the key element. And I think this is the reason why this meeting in Paris will be so decisive, so as to provide that input into the document, but also to show to the world that there is, again, strong consensus and that this is an inclusive process and will continue to be inclusive as we continue to move forward to the next in-session meetings.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And Anya, did you have something you wanted to add as well?
Yeah, I would just add to that that in addition to ensuring that there's consensus and that we see all the pieces we want in the zero text that will come out of INC2, it's also important to ensure that language or provisions that set us back or would potentially be harmful towards reaching the environmental outcomes we want with this treaty are not included. Thinking specifically about language surrounding provisions for chemical recycling or harmful conversion technologies that do not actually recycle or recover plastics and instead end up burning plastics through pyrolysis or gasification. So I think this is a really crucial moment to make sure that all the negotiators are well informed about the potential harms that setting dangerous precedent could be included in the INC2 as well.
Thank you so much, Anya. Our next question comes from Emma Bryce. She's a freelance journalist who contributes to The Guardian and China Dialogue Oceans. For journalists attending INC2 in person or remotely, what would you advise we look out for on ghost gear as negotiations progress in Paris? What are the key things to tune into or watch out for? Felipe, would you like to take this one?
Sure, absolutely, Roya. Thank you. I think the first point to mention to the person that made the question is that there will be, and maybe a lot of people that are also listening in, will be important for them. That is that there will be no virtual participation in the meetings. All the meetings, the INC2 meeting is an in-person only negotiation, and therefore, for anyone that wants to follow this process, quote unquote live, it is important for them to realize that they won't have to be on the ground in Paris. Now, to the specifics of the question, what to look out for, I think the main items that people interested in the fishing / ghost gear topic should be out in the lookout for is the fact of some of the member states and countries, their statements from the floor. And I think it's important to see some of the leading countries on this topic, see what type of statements they're going to put out there and the content of those statements around fishing and ghost gear. Meaning, is it a comprehensive statement? Do they want specific binding and non-binding solutions to the problem? Do they want to keep it outside of the agreement? That is also a possibility by some of the countries to push to not be mentioned in the agreement. And so I think the first one is what the member state will be saying from the floor. I think the second one is what the coalitions will be mentioning at the floor or throughout their different platforms. One of the key constituencies to keep a lookout there is the High Ambition Coalition, which is a coalition of right now, I believe, 51 countries that are leading the charge on many of these broad emerging consensus topics, especially on the more ambitious side. And I think it will be also interesting to see what it will be their position when it comes to fishing and ghost gear as a bloc and as individual members. And the third one is what is going to be the Secretariat's role to those comments and see how they're going to reflect those comments, those statements from blocs or individual states into the actual text of the document itself once it comes out.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And I will address our next question to Joel. Why is it so important that ghost gear is addressed on an international basis instead of just a country by country basis?
It's a really good question. I think the easiest answer to that is because ALDFG or ghost gear doesn't respect national boundaries. If it gets lost in one country, it can travel across ocean currents, affect a completely different country. And international consensus on how to deal with this issue holistically is the best way to make sure that we're as aligned as we can be and have the greatest chance of solving it in the long term. That said, there will be very specific considerations that each country will need to deal with in terms of their own geography, the fishing methods that are used, the gear types that are used. So there will be individual considerations to take into account when we're talking about specific countries. But in terms of having a lasting impact across the globe, which is really what's needed here, the ILBI is the best opportunity that I think we're going to get to try to get as many of those measures and recommendations that we have through our voluntary and mandatory inclusions, our recommendations for those in the ILBI as possible to make sure that we have the best chance at solving this in the long term.
Thank you so much, Joel. Next question that I have is for Dr. Brandon. You mentioned the California Plastics Bill SB 54. Are there other bills currently in the works to address plastic pollution?
Yeah, great question. Looking at the US, there's really been a flurry of activity in state legislatures and even at the local level to try to address plastic pollution. I think a lot of these activities have focused first and foremost on, banning or eliminating some of the most harmful types of plastic pollution that we see. So really eliminating the types of plastic product that we know are unrecyclable and end up polluting our beaches. And we still see that activity at the state level throughout the country. Just today, we expect a vote in Oregon on a bill that we've been leading to ban expanded polystyrene or foam foodware. So really targeting the types of plastics that we know are the most harmful to begin with. We've also seen an increase in activity on bills like the California bill, which are called extended producer responsibility bills. So actually holding the producers of this waste accountable for their wasteful products. This is not new. This has happened around the country or happened across the world, really, for packaging. Countries in Europe and Canada have had EPR for packaging for decades. And we here in the US have over 100 types of EPR systems for other types of really difficult to manage materials. Think tires or batteries or light bulbs. So it's just a new way of applying a very old well-studied and established type of legislation to packaging. California was incredibly unique in that it was the first bill to actually require source reduction of plastics. So really hitting this issue at its core by requiring that we make and use less plastic at the first place. This was not emulated in other state legislations just yet. There was a bill in Oregon that we also worked on, but we've seen it at the federal level now, both in a target that was included in the Protecting Communities from Plastic Act, introduced by Representative Huffman and Senator Booker, and in the recent draft national strategy to prevent plastic pollution that was introduced by EPA just last Friday. So some of their objectives in there mirror this source reduction language and requirements to actually reduce plastics from the beginning.
Thank you so much, Anya. So now I'm going to open up some of the questions that we've received via social media. And I'm going to start with, this can be for anyone who wants to jump in and answer. How can the average citizen do more to impact progress on this issue?
I can kick us off and then turn it over to you, Joel. I think something that I think about a lot is that no one can do everything, but everyone can do something. And so we all have both the individual power of our purchase. So our purchasing decision, whether or not we choose to support or buy more plastics, but we also have the power of our voice. Sometimes it's really hard to avoid plastics because we are not given other options. So in those moments, it's really, just as, if not more powerful, to take action through calling your representatives at the state or federal level and demanding that they do better on this issue. Yeah, turn it over to you, Joel.
Thanks, Anya. And coming from a fishing gear perspective, I think it's crucial for people to be as educated as they can be on this topic and understand what's actually going on out there. There's a lot of articles about the harm that ghost gear can impact on marine environments, on marine species, which is all true. But I think we also need to be cognizant of what is actually happening out there. And this is by and large not fishers throwing gear over the side of their boat. So it's not about burning the industry to the ground. It's about trying to understand what's actually going on out there. And coming from an industry background myself, the harbor where I used to work, there's a memorial at the front of the harbor where to all the fishers that didn't come back. And I think that it's crucial to understand. It's great to know where your seafood comes from, but it's also crucial to understand what is actually happening out there, and that fishing is not a fair weather industry. And so it's easy to say, don't fish in rough weather, but if that's when the opening that you have to feed your family is going to be, that's what it's going to be. Again, we talked about, billions of people that rely on seafood for their primary source of protein. I think being as educated as you can be, and being supportive of the industry, because a lot of the things that we are looking to do are ways to improve the conditions that are out there so that fishers don't lose gear and so that fishers have options to dispose of their gear at the end of their life. So be as educated as you can be educated on where your seafood is coming from, and push for some of these practices that are going to help the industry continue to move forward in a sustainable direction.
I would like to quickly add to that, and thank you, Dr. Brandon and Joel, for this very insightful comments. I would like to add to that that I think it's important for individual people to try to see, and this around the world, how they can get involved with their countries at the negotiations of the plastic agreement. Most of the countries have some type of consultative process internally, where civil society, the industry, private sector, academia, et cetera, usually contribute to their national position. And I think people can find ways to contribute to their national position and make sure that they're keeping their governments focused, they're keeping their governments accountable, they're keeping their governments ambitious, they're keeping their governments at all levels engaged in the process. And I think as individual citizens, as Dr. Brandon was saying, we can all do something. And to be a responsible citizen also allows you to get involved in the affairs of your country, right? And I think in that sense, every single person aggregated can have a huge impact on your national position at the negotiations of a multilateral treaty. So that will be my small contribution.
Thanks, everyone. And I just wanted to add as well that if you are interested in learning more about some of the actions that you can take, as Anya mentioned, we actually have a website for that will connect you with ways that you can help make progress on the issue. And you can check it out at oceanconservancy.org/action. And so now I'll move on to the next audience question. News says that in the plastic gyres, there's a new type of life that is happening, that is adapting to the ocean gyres. What have you heard about this, and what do you think about this latest news?
I can kick us off. I think one thing that's incredible is that it's been 50 years since we first discovered that these naturally occurring gyres in the ocean were concentrating marine debris. We've learned a lot in the subsequent 50 years of researching these gyres. For example, this type of concentration occurs in gyres throughout the world, in addition to the most famous and largest one that Joel mentioned, the Great Pacific Gyre. We've also learned that marine debris in these gyres looks a lot more like a soup than an island of floating marine debris. It's both macro and microplastics kind of scattered and embedded throughout the water column, not just at the surface like an island. And we've also seen evidence, as this recent paper mentioned, that plastics in the gyre can actually act as a vector or a raft for carrying marine life. That both increases the risk of invasive species and, spreading of disease if you're carrying a potentially harmful type of bacteria or bacteriophage to a new environment where it's not adapted for. So I think it's ecologically incredibly interesting that we have created this really artificial system chock full of these man-made products out floating in our ocean. And I think we're still learning all of the harmful repercussions that is having on our ocean.
Yeah, definitely interesting stuff. Thank you, Anya. And another question from our audience. Are there people doing tagging and or mapping studies with ghost nets to understand where they are accumulating in the oceans? Is the distribution any different than other forms of plastics? Joel, would you like to start us off on this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. The short answer is yes, those studies are happening. However, they tend to be most studies up until recently have tended to be fairly focused in a specific geography. So the sort of global study to try to figure out exactly how much gear is out there, where does it accumulate, those types of things. There have been attempts at that in recent years, but obviously it's still early days when it comes to that. There are challenges with that because just the causes for gear loss and the amounts of gear and the types of gear are so different depending on where you are. And it can be very different in a very short span of geographical distance. So people are trying to do that, but we are at sort of, I think we're really starting to build that puzzle, and we're not currently at a point where we can say that this is what it looks like across the world. But every piece of that puzzle is really important. And in terms of the distribution, they seem to be, at least the floating debris seems to be accumulating in the gyres, which again does differ from what you find with a lot of single-use plastics. And Anna, you can probably speak to this a little bit more clearly than I can, but they tend to be more close to shore. There's been some studies that have shown that they actually don't travel that far, generally speaking, if they're washing in from the land, then they actually don't go as far as we initially thought that they did. Whereas gear tends to take place out on the open sea, and so it gets caught up in those gyres a little bit more easily because that's where it originates, and then it finds its way into those gyres. The other thing to consider as well is that most of the studies that have been done, not all, but most of them have been looking at surface debris. And what actually happens subsurface is another story altogether. And because we're not just dealing with a flat surface like you would on the land, you're actually dealing with a three-dimensional space. And that gear can be in the water column, it can be on the surface, it can be stuck on something on the bottom. It becomes very difficult and very expensive to do that work. So the short answer to that is yes, these studies are happening, and there are ways to try to geolocate gear and see where it goes in ocean currents. I know that's being done in the Indian Ocean as well as the Pacific. So we're in early days, but that's definitely the direction that things are moving.
And Joel, I also think this would be a great moment to talk about the Ghost Gear Reporter app and some of the data collection that the GGI is engaging in. Could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So actually, in building on what I had said before, there are some mandatory gear loss reporting systems, such as in Norway and Canada, where gear loss has to be reported as a condition of license to gather more data on this issue and try to build this out on a national level and understand what's going on in national waters. And as Roya mentioned, the GGI has our own global data portal that you can see at globalghostgearportal.net. And the idea is to bring all the different data sets around the world that are being collected by research going on from large research organizations all the way down to small boots on the ground NGOs who are collecting data on this into one central location, so that we can start to paint a picture of what does gear loss look like around the world. And also you can download our Ghost Gear Reporter app for free on both the Apple App Store and the Android Google Play Store, called the Ghost Gear Reporter, and you can submit data directly to that portal to help build a global understanding of what's going on out there. So if you're out on the beach and you happen to have that app with you, you can take a picture of it, upload it to our data portal, and it becomes part of this information gathering process to help us better understand it. And I should also point out that at the 7th International Marine Debris Conference earlier, or I can't remember if it was this year or last year, time's lost all meaning, but either way, the government of Canada announced that the data that it is collecting through its mandatory gear loss reporting system is now being contributed directly to the GGI's data portal, and they're the first country to do that. We're hoping that other countries will start to gather that data in a holistic way and submit that data as well, so that we can really start to build that global picture.
Thank you so much, Joel. The next question from our audience is, why is there so much legislation that is focused on a % of reduction of new plastics and not a complete ban of plastics? There's plenty of existing plastic that can be recycled. So what do you think about this, Anya?
Great question. I think the % reduction is actually a relatively new concept for legislation. I know it was certainly new in California, and it took a lot of work and convincing and explaining to help people understand what that would actually look like. I think historically, a lot of our legislation has focused, and it's been easier to focus on banning new plastics, specific types of new plastics. So thinking especially about those types of plastics that are not recyclable and end up disproportionately being polluted in our beaches and our waterways. A lot of those bans have taken the form of, banning expanded polystyrene or, foam foodware, bans on straws, bans on bags, some of these other kind of most commonly collected items on our beaches. The focus of a % reduction is really to target this issue at its source. We know we are making too many plastics to begin with. And so the answer is to make less plastics. While I think, banning all plastics is probably out of the question for most legislatures at this point, we can really specifically target, say, single-use plastics with this % reduction to kickstart the industry and kind of kickstart the innovation on the types of alternatives we need. Thinking especially about transitioning to a reuse and refill economy where we don't need as much single-use packaging and products to begin with. So really starting with these % reductions can lead businesses, lead customers, kind of lead all of us as a society to recognizing what a future with less plastics looks like, and then allows us to, slowly come back and ramp up that ambition over time to really get to where we need to go in terms of plastic reduction.
Thank you so much, Anya. And another question from the audience. What are the key milestones that we need to complete to achieve our goal to eliminate plastic pollution and ghost gear? Sorry about that. I think this one could be open to anyone. I feel like there's a lot of solutions coming from all three of you. So whoever wants to start out, feel free.
In terms of milestones, I think, and one of the focuses of this webinar, again, is the ILBI. And I think that being able to include language that takes some of these specific cases into consideration. And again, most people are thinking, when they're thinking about plastics and plastics reduction, they're thinking about single-use plastics. The idea behind microplastics, the idea behind ghost gear, and these specific types and forms of plastics, this is our chance, as we've said, to really try to make sure that these things are addressed as holistically as possible in this once-in-a-generation opportunity. So I see the ILBI as really one of the, if not the most important milestone to try to make sure that these things are addressed in the way that they need to be addressed. I think you could go down a long list of steps to go for each individual one of these things. For Ghost Gear, we're looking to engage with governments, engage with our member organizations and our seafood industry members in particular as well, to try to make sure that these things are addressed. We have our best practice frameworks for the management of both fishing and aquaculture gear, which are targeted towards those different organizations, companies, governments, on what they can practically do right now. And I think building on what Anya had said earlier as well, you have to start somewhere, really. And as much as it's a super urgent issue, everyone knows that, we do need to start somewhere, and every step in the right direction is a step worth taking. And so you're not going to get from A to, I'm going to out myself as a Canadian, you're not going to get from A to Z all at once. I think that you do need to make sure that you have an incremental thing in place, but it needs to be urgent enough. And I think we're trying to balance those two things of making it urgent enough that these recommendations are taken seriously and implemented, but not going so total ban on everything right away that you actually end up backfiring and nothing actually gets done. So I think you do need to thread that needle, and that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, I would say on kind of plastic pollution writ large, we're thinking especially about macroplastic pollution. So a lot of those single-use items that we see out in our beaches and our ocean, the science is pretty clear on what we need to do to solve this problem. We need to make less plastics in the first place to the tune of 25 to 40%. We need to increase the quality and quantity of recycling so that we can actually transition to that circular economy where we are keeping the materials we do have and do need in the system. And we need to continue targeted and effective cleanups of the plastics that are already out in the environment. And that will look something like probably 40% of annual emissions still need to be cleaned up through those effective styles of cleanup efforts. So that's the roadmap. That's where we need to get. And I think, as Joel was mentioning, the ILBI or the treaty represents an opportunity to put us on that path to get to those goals. We know that there's plenty of work that countries have and can continue to do independently to support the global agreement and to even increase their own ambition relative to the ILBI. And we've seen this both at the national level and subnational level. But we really do, we have a light at the end of the tunnel in terms of where we need to be headed on this issue.
Yeah, and I quickly want to build on that, and thank you, Dr. Brandon, for mentioning specifically that. I think in that sense, the ILBI is critical and important, as both of you have said before, because of the overarching nature of internationally binding rules that would have on this sector. But I think in that sense, it's also very important that those international legally binding commitments of many of the member states in the agreement have to be compounded by a multi-government approach to the issue through national action plans or local action plans. And I think, as Dr. Brandon was mentioning, there are great examples out there of local governments, state governments, and national governments advancing a lot of good solutions and work, either through banning or through better recycling or better designing better system for circular economy, all across the full life cycle of plastics. There are great examples out there that can serve as guiding models or principles for the broader conversations and negotiations at the LBI. But the ILBI can also feed into that and serve as the second wheel to, between both of them, advance this holistic approach and in this once in a generation opportunity to tackle the issue.
Thanks so much, all of you. And just a reminder for our audience, we only have about 5 minutes left before we're at time. So if you would like to submit any more questions, please do so now. And in the meantime, I just wanted to see if any of you guys had some last thoughts that you would like to share.
Well, If I'll jump in, and I can definitely get us started with his last remarks or comments. I just want to mention to everyone that Ocean Conservancy will be on the ground present at the INC negotiations in Paris, as we were in Uruguay before that, and as we will continue to be in the subsequent upcoming in-person negotiations. Please feel free to get in touch with us. There will be a team of us on the ground, experts in on the different fields discussed in this specific conversation, but also more broadly. So the first reflection is we will be there on the ground. The second one is please feel free to reach out to us and get in touch with us. We would love to converse, to share thoughts, ideas of how between all of us, we can advance common solutions to common global problems. And thirdly, last and not least, please stay tuned on all the different developments from Ocean Conservancy regarding policy positions, regarding policy recommendations that we will be putting prior to the INC2 and also in the intersessional period between INC2 and INC3 as well. And keep an eye out as well to our comments once the zero draft is released. So I think it will be very important for organizations like Ocean Conservancy and many others around the world to be able to provide comments and feedback to that zero draft. So I encourage all of our audience here today to keep also an eye out for the zero draft, but at the same time for the policy comments relevant to the different topics that will be mentioned in the zero draft.
Thank you so much, Felipe. And I also just want to remind you guys out there that if you want to take action, as I mentioned earlier, there is a website page that we have for that, and it is oceanconservancy.org/action. There are plenty of great ways that you can get involved if you're passionate about ocean plastic pollution. And we also have, as you can see, different ways you can get involved beyond that. You can text OCEAN to 52551 or follow us on our different social media pages. We're at Our Ocean on Twitter and at Ocean Conservancy for Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The GGI, the Global Ghost Gear Initiative, also has a Twitter page, which is GGG Initiative on Twitter, and then the Global Ghost Gear Initiative on LinkedIn. Of course, we also put out regular blogs. We have things about plastic pollution, but we also just have lots of interesting facts about animals. There are updates about what all of our great teams at Ocean Conservancy are working on that you can find at oceanconservancy.org/blog. And then here are the emails for our panelists and myself. Any press inquiries, please email me at rhegdahl@oceanconservancy.org, and you can contact the different panelists at their respective emails here. And just a quick note, there is an F missing from Felipe's email, so it should be fvictoria@oceanconservancy.org. All right, and with that, we have only 2 minutes left to go. I think unless there are any more questions from our audience, we will wrap things up. And thank you so much, everyone who has tuned in today and for this lively discussion. Thank you, Joel, Anya, and Felipe for all of your important information that you shared with us as well.
Thank you, everyone. A pleasure to be here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.